So today we are going to look at another problem about probability. A cell phone manufacturing company has three production sites with different manufacturing capacity. Factory A is the largest that produces 70% of the company's product. Factory B accounts for 20% and Factory C produces only 10% of the company's product. However, it is known that 1% of the products coming from Factory A is defective, while 2% from Factory B is defective, and 4% from Factory C is defective. If a defective cell phone is found in the company warehouse, what is the probability that the defective cell phone comes from Factory A? Suppose this is the warehouse of the company, and we know that all the cell phones inside this warehouse comes from three different factories: Factory A, Factory B, and Factory C. 70% of the cell phones of the company comes from Factory A, 20% comes from Factory B, and only 10% comes from Factory C. We also know that some of the cell phones produced by Factory A is defective. We know, for example, that 1% of all the cell phones coming from Factory A is defective, and of course 99% is not defective. For Factory B, 2% is defective, and of course 98% is not defective. For Factory C, 4% is defective, and 96% is not defective. We don't know exactly how many cell phones are inside the company warehouse, but for simplicity's sake, let's pretend that there are 100 cell phones inside the company warehouse. We also know that 70% of the cell phones are coming from Factory A. So we can compute for 70% of 100, which means we have to multiply 0.7 times 100, which will give us 70. That means out of the 100 cell phones inside the company warehouse, 70 of those comes from Factory A. We can do the same thing for Factory B. We know that 20% of the company's cell phones comes from Factory B. So then we can multiply 20% of 100 or 0.20 times 100, and that will give us exactly 20. That means 20 cell phones out of the 100 cell phones inside the company warehouse comes from Factory B. For Factory C, of course, we only have to subtract 100 minus 70 minus 20, and the remaining is 10. So those 10 cell phones are coming from Factory C. Now let's look at the inside of Factory A. We know that 1% of all the cell phones produced by Factory A are defective. So then we can multiply or get the 1% of 70. We can say 0.01 times 70, and that will give us the number of defective cell phones out of 70. 0.01 times 70 gives us 0.7. So we can just say there are 0.7 defective cell phones produced by Factory A. And of course, to get a non-defective, we can just simply subtract 70 minus 0.7, and that will give us 69.3. So 69.3 are the non-defective cell phones coming from Factory A, and 0.7 cell phones are the defective ones coming from Factory A. We can do the same thing for Factory B. We know that 2% of the cell phones produced by Factory B are defective. So then we can compute for 2% of 20, or 0.02 times 20, and that will give us 0.4. So we know therefore that out of 20 cell phones produced by Factory B, 0.4 of that are defective. For the non-defective, we can just simply subtract 20 minus 0.4, and that will give us 19.6. That means out of the 20 cell phones, 19.6 are non-defective and 0.4 are defective. We will now do the same thing for Factory C. We know that 4% of cell phones produced by Factory C are defective, so we can say 4% of 10, or 0.04 times 10, are defective. So 0.04 times 10 gives us 0.4. That means out of 10, 0.4 are defective, and the non-defective, of course, is 10 minus 0.4, which will give us 9.6. So therefore, 0.4 are defective out of 10, and 9.6 are non-defective. So here's once more our diagram. As I said, we don't know how many cell phones are inside the company warehouse, but I choose 100 for simplicity's sake. Out of 100, we know that 70 of those comes from factory A, 20 comes from factory B, and 10 comes from factory C. We also know that out of 70 cell phones coming from factory A, 69.3 of those are non-defective, 0.7 are defective. Out of the 20 cell phones from factory B, 19.6 are non-defective, 0.4 are defective. And of course, coming from factory C, there's only 10 of them, 9.6 of those are non-defective and 0.4 are defective. Our problem is asking us to find the probability that if we know that the cell phone is defective, what's the probability that it comes from factory A? In other words, we only have to focus on the defective cell phones. Our defective cell phones are zero point 0.7 coming from factory A, and then zero point 0.4 coming from factory B, and zero point 0.4 again coming from factory C. So what we are going to do is add them all together to get our sample space. So we add zero point 0.7 plus zero point 0.4 plus zero point 0.4, that will give us 1.5. So this means that out of 1.5, what is the probability that it comes from, or the defective cell phone comes from factory A? We know that out of 1.5, 0.7 of those comes from factory A. Therefore, to get the probability, all we have to do is divide 0.7 divided by the overall total number of defective cell phones, which is 1.5. The answer to this is 0.467 or 46.7%. This is the probability that if a defective cell phone is found, it is coming from factory A. Thank you.